All right, joining us now, NBC News business and data correspondent Brian Chung. Also with us here on set, Axios senior economic reporter Courtney Brown. Brian, I'm going to start with you. For those of us who've been just overwhelmed and maybe on holiday or maybe just can't handle it anymore, can you please remind us what tariffs are in question here, which ones this ruling cover, and what could be impacted?
Yeah, Christina, this did happen very late on Friday as people were beginning their Labor Day weekend. So excusable if you didn't understand kind of exactly what this ruling means. But what we're talking about here are a big chunk of the tariffs, which are a real cornerstone of the president's economic policies, but not all of them. So basically, here are the ones that are impacted by this particular judgment here. These are the so-called IEEPA authority tariffs that the president has been waging against essentially every country around the world on a bilateral basis. You'll recall that big flashy Rose Garden announcement where he had that poster board where there were all those countries alongside the tariff rates that he wanted to slap on those countries. Those are the ones that this court said are illegal. It also includes those on Mexico, Canada, as well as China under the so-called fentanyl tariffs. But I do want to point out this does not impact some of these industry-specific tariffs, like the steel and aluminum levies, which have been wagered on those industries using different authorities under the Commerce Department, as well as those tariffs on China that were imposed during the president's first term. One other thing that's worth noting here, de minimis. This is a word that not a lot of people are familiar with. This is basically a loophole that's been around since 2016. That's allowed items under $800 in value to come into this country tax-free. The president closed that loophole as of last Friday. Now levies will be applied to those types of items. That is not impacted by this particular ruling either, Christina.
And I've seen a lot of outcry on that one, particularly from, small businesses I follow on social media saying they're not going to ship to the U.S. anymore because they're just not sure they can afford it. Brian, I also want to ask you what the White House says their argument is for the appeal where does this all stand to go? Do you think we end up back at the Supreme Court?
Yeah, well, basically, the legal basis by which the president was putting these country-specific tariffs in place, so they were using, again, this International Emergency Powers Act, where basically the president was trying to argue that it was an emergency. There's a national security and a national emergency reason for why they needed to slap all these countries like in Indonesia, like Brazil, like India, like the European Union with these specific tariffs. This court finding that the presidential authority doesn't exist for them to do that, and that it really is in more of the legislative powers to levy these types of tariffs on our trading partners. So, again, whether or not the appellate courts and then ultimately up to the Supreme Court decide to rule in favor here is an open question, especially now that we've heard from Peter Navarro and the White House and the president via Truth Social that they do intend to appeal this particular hearing. But, Christina, it's worth pointing out this is now the second court that has basically said they find these types of tariffs illegal, but it is a conservative majority on the Supreme Court. Will they decide in the president's favor? That's an open question. But for the time being, this is very important to point out, the tariffs do remain in effect. And for that reason, a lot of businesses that are wondering what happens here, nothing really changed between Friday and Monday. But the question in the future, what happens with the Supreme Court potentially weighing in on this?
So, Courtney, what's your take? What about that? You've got these two court decisions that seem to be creating a bit of a pattern. The Supreme Court is a conservative majority, but this particular issue might be a little more clear-cut than some of the other policies, right? You're going into, like, the enumerated powers of Congress versus the president. What is your take? Where do you see this ending up?
So we've been reporting a lot on how President Trump has kind of sneakily been ramping up the trade war in ways that aren't so sexy as making a huge Rose Garden announcement on Liberation Day. But we saw a few weeks ago the president widened the steel and aluminum tariffs under a different trade power, Section 232, which has a more precedent than the IEEPA tariffs do. So we really think that President Trump is going to lean on this Section 232 power to implement the bulk of his trade agenda if ultimately the Supreme Court decides that, yeah, you can't impose tariffs the way that you've been imposing.
So that's maybe a better way for them to do it, to stick on the right side of the courts?
Better way for them to get their trade agenda to stick.
Okay, Brian, I also want to ask, following this ongoing legal battle between the White House and the Federal Reserve Governor Lisa Cook, when do we think that, federal court determination might come down, whether or not Trump had the grounds to actually dismiss her?
Well, it could be this week. There was a lot of attention on the Friday proceedings in the court in D.C. That was at 10 a.m. on Friday. There was some expectation that maybe a judge in that case would be weighing in on whether or not Lisa Cook, who again is this Federal Reserve governor, she's one of the people that decides on interest rates in this country, which is of enormous importance to the president, who has been arguing for much lower interest rates. The White House has lobbed these allegations of mortgage fraud, which, even though there is a criminal complaint to the Department of Justice, there have been no charges pressed against her. So that's part of her defense in saying there hasn't even been proof, or it hasn't even been litigated whether or not I did mortgage fraud, which she denies. But nonetheless, there was that court proceeding that didn't result in anything. Basically, the judge kind of kicking the can down the road for later on this week. So again, could that happen tomorrow or Wednesday? It depends on what's on the docket. But for the time being, it seems like there is still that ambiguity over whether or not she can serve as the president continues to try to fire her in this bid to try to exert a little bit more control over the central bank.
And Courtney, Trump raised questions about that judge, the federal judge overseeing Cook's case, in a Truth Social post yesterday. What's your reaction, and what does that signal to where he might go next with this whole thing?
As Brian kind of suggested, we ended the day on Friday not knowing whether Lisa Cook has a job.
Yeah.
That is so crazy. We have a Fed policy decision in 2 weeks, and we don't know whether one of the top officials is going to have a say in what the Fed does.
Or even be in the room.
Or even be in the room, even be allowed in the building. I listened to the hearing on Friday, as many other reporters did. And we didn't really get a clear takeaway of which way the judge was leaning. So I know that President Trump wants to rail on the judge, but there was an instance where she was asking Lisa Cook's lawyers, well, what if she did commit mortgage fraud? Does that count as cause? It's a good question. So we don't know which way the judge is leaning, what they will decide, but hopefully we get an answer this week. I know financial markets are paying attention to this case quite closely.
It's a list of several answers I would like by this week, but might not be entirely likely. All right. Courtney Brown, Brian Cheung, thank you both so much.